Hi, welcome to lesson 9 of our PMP certification training. Once again, my name is Obalim and I'm going to be your anchor person. So in this particular lesson, we shall be taking a look at the very interesting knowledge area, which is project communications management. So project communications management basically talks about information retrieval, dissemination, and then also ultimate management of information within your project. This is arguably one of the most important aspects of your project. So you ask yourself, why are we dedicating a whole knowledge area to communications? Because communications is at the heart of your project. I mean, done right, your project succeeds, but if you get the communication wrong, you will notice that that will affect the project negatively. So in this lesson, we shall be taking a look at what project communications mean, then also define different communication methods as well as channels and technology, then explain the elements of basic communication model. We shall also describe what we refer to as project communication management processes. So here we shall be taking a look at 3 processes. So there are only 3 processes under project communications management. So when we mention communication, what does communication mean to you? So in its simplest term, communication can simply be referred to as exchange of information. So it simply means that communication is a two-way process. There is a sender, and then of course there is a receiver. So of course there is a way the communication goes from the sender to the receiver, and then of course there is a feedback which illustrates the effectiveness of the project communication. So we say that communication is a two-way process of transferring information from one entity to another. So it's basically how we transfer information from one entity to another, and that's what project communication refers to. And then don't forget that project manager spends around 90% of time ensuring proper project communication, because what you do as a project manager most times is actually communication. So it's either you're negotiating, you're holding a meeting, you're giving instruction, you're doing report, you're analyzing, you're able to determine your project status, and then also you're able to come up with your project information report. All of these things are all about communication. So that's why we say that 90% of the project manager's time is spent communicating. So there are various communication methods, and some of the popular communication methods are, we have what we refer to as formal written communication. All formal communication simply means communication that carries the backing of an authority and follows a certain set of rules put in place. These are what we refer to as formal communication. While informal communication takes a casual approach. Casual approach in the sense that when we talk about informal communication here, we're basically saying that it doesn't follow a defined set of rules. That's one key thing that informal communication focuses on. When we talk about the various methods of communication, when we combine these two forms, will result in what we refer to as communication methods. And like I mentioned earlier on, there's a formal written communication, which simply means a written communication that follows a specific defined rules, and then also usually comes with a backing on authority. So they will include examples like your project management plan, your project charter, and then also maybe long distance communication. For example, send via speed post like DHL, say for example some important project documents like contract. All of these are part of what makes up your formal written communication. Then there's a formal verbal communication. Formal verbal communication talks about things like you're making a presentation, just like I'm doing in an organization or an office. This is what we refer to as a formal verbal communication. We also have informal written communication. So informal written communication refers to things like your emails, your notes. These are communications that don't necessarily need to follow, specific set of rules, and sometimes can actually be casual. And then also there's the informal verbal communication, which is now like conversations, chit chats. All of these are what we now refer to as informal verbal communication. So some of the various communication technology that we have, basically they refer to the media that are used to carry out communication. So some very common communication technologies in our current day world includes telephone. You have the fax, emails, messaging software, for example, like your WhatsApp, your Telegram, your Facebook Messenger. These are messaging software. Then also meetings, for example, GoToMeeting, Cisco WebEx, Zoom, Google Meet. All of these are meeting tools. Then also Skype. Then of course, talk about Facebook, social media like Twitter, and then also blogs like Blogger, WordPress, and all of that. So these are various communication technology that can actually be used to pass across information to a desired audience. So next, we shall talk about what we mean by communication channels. So we say that communication channels basically is how you can reach every member of the team, and then also ways that each team member can also reach every other person within the team. So in a nutshell, communication channel simply talks about how each one can reach one within the team. So in order for us to determine the number of communication channels to have in a project, we use the formula n is into n minus 1 divided by 2. So n bracket n minus 1 divided by 2. This is the formula for calculating your communication channels. So let's say, for example, in this case, we have 4 team members. So for us to know the number of communication channels, don't forget that n is equals to the number of stakeholders. So n represents the number of stakeholders that we have in our project. So for us to now determine the number of communication channels we now need to create, is now going to be 4 into 4 minus 1 divided by 2. So 4 minus 1 is 3. So we have it as 4 is into 3 divided by 2. And then we open up the bracket. 4 times 3 is 12. So it's now going to be 12 divided by 2. And then 12 divided by 2 would give us what? 6. So it simply means that if we have a team of 4 persons, we're going to have 6 various ways we can reach one another. And that's one key thing that the communication channel here refers to. Again, if we have a situation where our n is equals to 10, in other words, you have 10 stakeholders, how many communication channels would exist? Of course, if you do the math with 10, you're going to get 45 communication channels. So when a large number of communication channels exist, it may get chaotic if communication is not structured. So this is part of the reason why determining your communication channel is key, so that you'll be able to structure your communication or possibly break it down, then also break down your project into smaller teams that will enable you to effectively communicate and then be able to pass across relevant information. Now we also talk about communication model. So the process of communication involves several steps. So these are some of the simple communication models. We have what we now refer to as the sender, and then there's the receiver. So the sender is the person who encodes. Encode simply means to be able to translate whatever information you have, and then of course be able to structure it and put it in a defined manner that can actually be easily sent, transmittable, and then also understandable by the receiver. So the message is what is encoded, and then this encoded message is now passed through a medium. Of course, the medium can be either via telephone, all of those media we talked about earlier on, fax, email, and all of that. Now, typically within every medium, there's what we refer to as noise. Noise simply refers to anything that can deter, distract, or take away from the information. That's what we refer to as noise. So the goal of communication at every point in time should be, how do we reduce noise to the barest minimum? And then of course the information or the message is now sent to the receiver, who decodes. Decode simply means to understand. And then typically the receiver will now communicate back his or her understanding of the message, and that's the encoding process for the receiver, which of course now is what we refer to as the message feedback, which is also sent via a medium, and then also can also be affected by noise, and then of course back to the sender to decode. So that's why we say that communication is a two-way process, and that communication is not complete until there is a feedback. So this is essentially how communication model essentially runs. So let's take a look at this example. A Japanese tourist calls a hotel in Dubai to book a room. The tourist, speaking Japanese, is encoding the message. Telephone serves as the medium. However, decoding is problematic as the receptionist does not understand Japanese. The same would be true if the receptionist speaks Arabic. However, communication can be streamlined if they communicate in a language comprehensible to both of them. So you can see in this case, we have the encoder, which is the Japanese, we have the medium, which is the telephone, and then we have the noise, which is now the various differences in language. So that's why I said the goal of communication should be how to reduce or eliminate the noise. So it's either you have maybe like a translator, or we have a situation where we make sure that the receptionist understands relevant languages, and then all of these are ways that will enable us ensure effective communication. So analyzing your communication model helps in identifying the communication problems. And then of course, remember we mentioned that encoding is the process of translating thoughts or ideas into a language that is understood by others, while decoding is the process of translating the message back into meaningful thoughts or ideas. The message is the output of encoding, while feedback message is the output of encoding. Then also medium is the communication method to convey the message, while noise is anything that interferes with the transmission and understanding of the message. Examples include distance as well as unfamiliar technology. So talking about project communication management, so of course this includes processes necessary to ensure that information needs of the project and its stakeholders are met through development of artifacts and implementation of activities designed to achieve effective information exchange. So in essence, when we talk about project communications, we're basically talking about, when we talk about project communications management, we're basically talking about all activities that will be involved in planning, decimating, disseminating, as well as controlling our project information. All of that is what we address under project communications management. So like we mentioned earlier on, there are three processes under project communications management. And then the three processes we have under project communications management are: you plan communications management, you manage communications, and then you monitor communications. So when we plan communications, as usual, this is where we determine how we're going to go about our communications processes. And then during the manage communication, this is an executing process. So this is where we now begin to send out project information based on the plan that we have. And then during the monitor communication, we now determine the effectiveness of our project communications. So this is what we're going to be stopping in the very first part of project communications management. So when we come back in the part 2, we're now going to be taking a look at the ITTOs of each of these processes we have under project communications management, including the plan, the manage, and then also the monitor communication. I hope this particular lesson has been very informative for you. Once again, thank you for listening.